Today we've got Leah Payne with us, and Leah is going to give you the whole history of CCM music. The
The
whole
entire
history, right,
thing.
Leah?
That's right.
Just the whole thing, right?
That's right. Not the a history. That's
Oh,
what I'm gonna give
A.
you.
Ooh, you sound like an academic right
Yeah,
there.
you
If you're just
sound like
doing the A
Howard
versus
Zinn.
You
the.
gotta cover your bases. You can't be saying to be you can't be pretending like you're the. You gotta just go A. That's me. I'm gonna
Yeah,
give you A history.
that's Howard
Well,
Zinn
here's the thing.
style.
We're not like a book publisher. We're just like a podcast that only two people will listen to. So you could do
I
the if you
doubt that.
want.
Okay. Sure. No, I'm excited. I can't wait to be here. I'm a little bit nervous for you all too, because I know you're real fans. So you're gonna
We
like
might know a thing or two.
I think you do. I think you do. I'm excited about it. Thanks for having me.
We're excited. We're excited. Well, let's get started with just kind of honestly more than interesting, or more than anything. What is interesting to me as somebody who has navigated a little bit of the scholarship world is like the whole point of being like a scholar is that like
Mhm, mhm.
you disconnect yourself, your own personal story from your
Right.
scholarship, right? Like you're supposed to just be an
Mhm.
objective observer of what you're observing, right? And yet, at the same time, you clearly have investment, personal investment into this kind of scholarship. So I'd love to just hear, obviously, again, we're not scholars by any means.
Right, right.
I mean, I'm literally drinking some alcohol. I'm sure Cullen's got a little thing right now. Well, Cullen's literally, yeah, he's got his thing. We're
Hi, Colin.
clearly not
Hi.
scholars.
Okay.
So we'd love to hear just a little bit more of like your own, like kind of personal journey of like how you got into CCM, because for so many of us, like
Sure.
CCM starts in so many different places. So I'd love to just hear from you. Like, how did you get involved in CCM and what's that story?
Yeah, so and I'd like to just make a little note about, objectivity and whether or not people who have experience with something can or can't, I think there's trade-offs to what if you're an
Mhm.
outsider versus an insider. So you always want to be aware of your experiences and biases as an insider, but I think that insider knowledge can give you things that outsider knowledge can't. So ideally, we're all in this together as scholars. And I do have some insider perspective on contemporary Christian music. I was raised on the West Coast in a little charismatic congregation, like super charismatic congregation. So I was raised on music that's kind of like the foundation of what we know of contemporary Christian music. It's music called
Heck yeah.
Jesus music. So
Do you
my
ever think
dad,
about if you like, especially for those like early charismatic people, or
yeah.
the people that like grew up in the 80s and 90s and charismatic? I've always thought about this. Like, if they had one of those watches that counted calories, could you imagine just like what your worship like calorie count would be?
Oh,
Because like you're running up and down those
unbelievable.
aisles, you're running
Unbelievable. Yeah.
across. Like
Yeah.
I've
You
always
raise
like
the bar.
Yeah.
that's a whole CrossFit exercise just by
Oh, yeah.
being in worship with God.
Yeah, I mean, add flags, tambourines,
Yeah.
Oh my
yes,
goodness.
absolutely, absolutely. That is a fit way to praise the Lord. Yes, I was raised in a very, very charismatic church, and, so with the music of those West Coast revivals, my parents went to a little Bible college, in San Jose in the 1970s, so that was, like, right where all that stuff was happening, and so if you know anything about Jesus music, and so yeah, I was raised with Keith Green and Second Chapter of Acts and Larry Norman. That kind of music was just like, and Daniel Amos, I should say. That music was just like how it was just like the air that was
Mm.
our home. But my dad did not like contemporary Christian music. He thought the quality was poor. I write about this a little bit in the book. And so I didn't really grow up with contemporary Christian music the way that I would assume a lot of your most devoted listeners did, which was as an antidote to the poison of secular music. So because my dad just didn't like it. So I kind of missed a lot of the cultural value of CCM,
Mm.
just me personally. But because I grew up in a small Pentecostal church, I mean, of course I knew what it was. Like everybody, most of my friends went to Christian, most of my church friends went to music festivals and, um, you know, did all of the stuff that was associated with contemporary Christian music. So when after college, I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, and I ended up working for a music producer, a very well-known music producer in CCM, a guy named Charlie Peacock, who is responsible for some of the biggest acts in contemporary Christian music, but his career is much broader than that. He's worked with a lot of other people. But anyway, so I worked in the business for a little while. And then I went to graduate school, became a historian, and I just, CCM as a thing kind of kept coming back to me because
Mm,
I kept thinking about how powerful it was and how in American religious history circles, it was usually mentioned on the outskirts of things. Like it was like kitsch, but not central.
Mm.
And in my experience, the world of CCM was very, very, very powerful in the lives of the people who were involved in evangelical culture. So that's kind of how the idea for the book began. Was like, well, what if you look at the kitsch? What if you look at this thing that's supposed to be, something that a lot of people think of as just like um, an afterthought a little bit, or a lot of people will think of it as sort of a remnant of an embarrassing evangelical past, or something like that. I wanted to look at it as a really important force in creating evangelicalism, and I wanted to see what it could tell us about the development of this movement that we call
mhm.
evangelical. And of course, I found myself following people like you, Mason, because you're so funny on social media, like your little jokes. You've got a lot of great CCM jokes. So, yeah, I would love to hear y'all. Like, what's your background in, like, what was your entry point to thinking about contemporary Christian music?
Well, mine is way more serious than that.
Oh, good.
I'm just kidding. Colin, what I'd love to hear kind of your CCM story. Like how did you get into all
So
this
yeah,
mess?
my CCM story was kind of strange. Mason and I both grew up in South Dakota, which is kind of
Oh, interesting.
it's kind of a desert of a lot of things. And I would say that
I have family from Sturgis.
oh,
So,
do you?
yeah.
We
Mhm.
grew up on the other side of the state. We're
Oh,
like
really?
basically we're
Okay.
kind of
Yeah,
like Minnesotans in a way, but not
Oh, yeah.
really.
Okay. That's great.
that's
Okay.
cool. I have a
Anyway,
sister
yeah.
that lived in Sturgis for a long time.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah. So yeah, it's kind of a desert for a lot of things. And I would say that after hearing so many people's experiences on this podcast, we did not have the same CCM kind of upbringing that a lot of people have had.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that comes down to just that culture doesn't get up here as quickly or as easily as elsewhere. But no, the mainstays were always there. The Jesus music kind of revolution, I guess you could say. But then it became very like the moment that I noticed it is when it really became ultra commercialized. Um,
Mhm.
this is actually a thing that I'm actually really interested to hear what you have to say
Sure.
is at what point like we could take it all the way back to like the spiritual gospels of former enslaved people and things like that, because I think that's really where it does come from initially. But where does it become ultra commercialized? At what point would you say?
Oh, me. So it's really hard to know where to start a book like this, right? Because if you're talking about Christian people and music, then you have to talk about like the beginning, like
Yeah.
so the New Testament. But so I ended up making a decision to start it where the business started, which
Mm,
was in the early 20th century,
Mhm.
with these mostly white revivalists who were appropriating Black music, so who were um, sometimes, like in the case of Pentecostals, for example, there were some interracial versions of Pentecostalism, but overall, the business was started by holiness people, Baptists, and Pentecostals who were revivalists. So they were people who were well practiced at the kind of altar call version of Christianity that many people associate with evangelicalism. But they created these
Also, what
revival
kind of
books.
years are you talking about here?
Like early 20th century. So 1897 was like kind of the beginning of
Okay.
um, the revivals that inspired some of the. So one of the biggest labels in contemporary Christian music was Benson, and the Benson family started creating songbooks, revivalist songbooks, in the early 1900s. John T. and Eva Green Benson, and they were these Nazarene. They became Nazarenes. They kind of helped found the Nazarene Church. So they were holiness people. And then there were a bunch of Baptists and then Pentecostals. And I would argue that Pentecostals really brought the most in terms of the music.
Mhm.
And this little group of people in the American South, um, Southern people had been making music for hundreds of years, but it didn't get national distribution until technology changed to where instead of publishing music mostly in really elite cities like Philadelphia and New York, middle class ish people in the South could afford to publish their own music. So the music of the South went kind of all over the United States, and these like really catchy revivalist songs took off. But they didn't really get, I would say, the beginning of CCM as a commercial venture, like a really viable commercial venture. I think I'd have to say Amy Grant is kind of the
Mm.
beginning of contemporary Christian
So
music
even
as like,
after like people like Keith Green and everything, like that whole
well,
Yeah.
movement.
I think Jesus music. So in the book I write about, Jesus music kind of solves a problem for conservative white revivalists. So from the get-go, revivalists were the revivalists who made the music that becomes CCM. They were really concerned about shaping the country in what they thought were God honoring ways. They were concerned. They had a really strong sense of activism, especially when it came to the young. So one of the early versions of that would be teetotaling and prohibition. So there were lots of
Mhm.
songs, revivalist songs, talking about the devil's brew. Like you would be in trouble, Mason, um, and trying to like convince.
Wouldn't be my first time, Leah.
Yeah, trying to convince the young, not to drink alcohol. And so they had a fair amount of success with that. I mean, getting a federal ban on the manufacturing and sale of alcohol is no small venture. But so they were really well practiced at like, we're going to use music to shape the young. But then the music itself became a huge problem in the form of rock and roll. And so rock music, it comes out of Black American culture, a lot of different musical forms, and then also Black and white Pentecostal churches. And it was very confounding for conservative white revivalists because they were like, we're going to use music to shape the young. And then the music that the young we have condemned. So there
Mm.
were like around 10 years or so, maybe more like 15 years or so, there were all these kind of efforts at trying to create alternatives to rock. So I cover a lot of the vocal jazz groups. There was a really famous like folk ensemble called Up With People that was not from the revivalist networks, but there were like Baptist groups that would try and imitate that type of stuff. And it just didn't catch on the way rock did. So Jesus music, in my mind, solves a problem for white revivalists because it is an acceptable form of music made by young people for young people that is authorized by big important people like Billy Graham, who brought a bunch of Jesus people to a big revival meeting in Dallas known as Expo 72, which is kind of like usually the inciting incident of contemporary Christian music because it brought these kind of wild West Coast hippie people, many of whom had really dramatic conversion experiences, um, and like really mystical, wild experiences, and then wrote songs about it. And then Expo 72 exposed the traditional Sunday school networks that Billy Graham could attract in Dallas to the hippie aesthetic. And so
Mhm.
all of a sudden it was like, well, these hippie kids, they look like rebels. They look very dangerous, but they're singing about the second coming. They're singing about like all this apocalypticism. And so, yeah, rock's okay now, and so that was a huge boon. But I think most of the Jesus people were just not commercially viable because they weren't professionals. They were, a lot of them had very, they were, some of them could be kind of ornery or unpredictable. They were rock stars, like in the way that rockers can be a little bit like that. I mean, some of them weren't, but I'm just saying like a lot of them were not necessarily polished and professional.
Mm.
And then Amy Grant is this beautiful upper class Southern woman who is just like unbelievably poised. I don't know. I've watched decades of interviews with her. You cannot catch that woman saying a false word. I mean, she's just unbelievable. So I think she's the beginning of,
Mm.
and by all accounts, by the way, like the nicest person. And people are very, very protective of her. I learned that
Oh yeah.
people were like, don't come for my Amy Grant, So by all accounts, just like the nicest person in the world. However, I think she was like a professional. Like you could build an industry around artists like that.
Right.
Whereas Larry Norman, you're not, he's going to do his own thing no matter what. So that was the longest answer, but that is my answer for you, which is, that's why I think she's the beginning.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, and I think your dad was onto something by saying that, this a lot of this music just doesn't really hold a candle to some of the other good stuff that's being played right now.
It's funny. My dad is so not online. He has no idea, but I'm talking about him all the time. Like, yeah, he was kind of ornery about it. So sorry, Dad. So, anyway.
Well, that's a common trope that Mason and I talk about all the time too, though, is that a lot of times there was always that Christian alternative that was never quite as good as maybe what the secular could bring out. Um, through your research,
Yeah.
have you found that to be kind of a thing as well? And then once that the bigger money comes along with it to kind of fund some of these people to try to make them a little more polished,
Yeah.
in that ultra commercialized world, is that a benefit or is that a negative? Or maybe you don't want to put a quantity on that or
Oh,
a
yeah.
thought on that
That's a
necessarily,
great
but
question.
yeah,
Yeah, I would say it was ultimately unsustainable. So whether or not it's good or bad, the fun thing for me was I, a lot of histories of contemporary Christian music focus on the perspective of the artists and how these, like, their art develops over time. And I tried to be pretty focused on the business end of things. So, why did
right,
the business do what it did? And from the business side of things, it totally makes sense to have derivative pop music because because of the mission of contemporary Christian music as a whole, there were always exceptions. So I try to point out that there are lots of exceptions along the way. But the main business model was a model that was built on providing safe alternatives to what was seen as dangerous secular music, so just mainstream music. So that meant that by design, contemporary Christian music was always going to lag behind mainstream music. And that was, of course, well known in the industry. But I think and usually most industry people would say, well, it's like about 18 months to 3 years behind whatever mainstream act was out there. And in some ways it worked for a long time because the target consumer was a teen, but the target customer was the teen's mom.
mom,
Right.
And
yeah.
so
Yes.
moms, I'm a mom, I am like cool is so far in the rearview mirror, and I was telling my son, like, you never come to me, he's still in the age where he thinks everything I do is awesome, but you know, don't
Hold on
come
to
to
that for
me.
as long
I
as you can, by
know
the way.
it's a treasure, but I'm not going to know what's cool. You can't ask me to tell you what's cool. And so I think it lasted for quite some time because the people mostly who were buying the music. Now, there are always exceptions, and I know you guys are Tooth and Nail people, and I think Tooth and Nail thrived in part because they did something a little bit different. They were doing more peer-to-peer sales, but your average top-selling CCM artist was being purchased by moms. So moms just don't know. Like, they don't know what's cool, or they're trying so hard. There were so many stories of Christian bookstore. A lot of times there would be young men, mostly men, who would work in Christian bookstores and help curate. They did a lot, I think, to try, like, teens did a lot to try and curate like a little separate section that had, like edgy music. But a lot of times it's grandmas coming in saying like, my son likes AC/DC, and then they would say, listen to Petra, which if you listen to AC/DC, you know that is not a substitute.
Not at all.
So, yeah. So,
So the business side is always really an interesting side for me. And I'd love to hear a little bit more again, because
yeah,
Cullen and I are coming more from like the tooth and nail world,
right.
and certainly a lot of our listeners are. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, and I know like you give a little sort of like kind of moment for tooth and nail, but it
Yep.
it doesn't take
Mhm.
up the entire book, obviously. But
Right.
I'd love to hear, just based on like some of your studies around tooth and nail that might not even have made the book. Um,
Yes.
but clearly there's a moment where you go from the moms being the market,
Mhm.
essentially, regardless if that market is for technically the teen girl or not. The
Right.
market is really for the mom, to now all of a sudden you have a market that opens up where like the mom is not in control of like if your kid is listening to Living Sacrifice
Right.
or MXPX or
Right.
something, right?
Uh-huh.
Like that is completely dictated by like your teenage boy.
Mhm.
And that changes the dynamic of like what the business side is
Right.
doing. And I'd
Right.
love to hear, just like, again, because your book is like more focused on the business side, like
Right.
how does something like tooth and nail entering into the picture of CCM as kind of this like subcategory, knowing that it's actually doing business in a very different way than the general market of CCM is. I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of that
Yes.
history, that again, like I know, knowing that tooth and nail is like not a huge part of the book, but knowing that like you certainly have probably studied a little bit of this.
Yes, and I have to say I have so much respect for tooth and nail fans. I'm a tiny bit scared of y'all, because, these are like the true fans. These y'all are like the fans. So I found that s it w tooth and nail, the 2 labels that I spend the most time, on when it comes to the indie labels of the '90s are what I think are kind of 2 of the most powerful ones, and no one argues that Tooth and Nail is the biggest. But I also interviewed Frank Tate of 5 Minute Walk, who
Oh.
is responsible for Five Iron Frenzy.
Mhm.
Yep.
But I would never cross a Five Iron Frenzy fan. That would be the last thing I did
Yeah.
probably in this life.
You want
So
to you want to lose your tenure. Cross the five iron
exactly. They'll
fire
figure out
ends.
a way. They'll figure out a way. I have nothing but respect for you people. But anyway, so those folks to me, and I didn't get to, I wish I would have had more time in the book, but those folks to me are like a continuation of Jesus music, I think in a lot of ways, which is to say that the vast majority of the bands that come out of those networks are on the West Coast, and their scene develops in large part in churches that had like remnants of those Jesus people. A lot of them are like kids of Jesus people.
Mm.
And those churches, they're mostly a lot of there was a huge Calvary Chapel scene, and then also Foursquare and Vineyard churches. Those churches um, really had an eye for like developing youth culture and youth ministry, and so there were like skate parks and like
Yeah.
massive, like unbelievably like huge production value concert series, and but then like little basements where people, so they did a lot to promote young people making music for other young people. And that is the key to their success,
Mm,
because most of the kind of corporate stuff that came out of Nashville was built on a very profitable model of selling to suburban white moms. But Tooth and Nail was by design. A young guy created the label with the idea that, there are all these young people who they don't want to listen to Carmen. They want to listen to, um, like some kind of death metal. So I think in those guys, because most of that was just like totally shoestring budget, they were super creative. One of the
Mhm.
best stories Frank Tate told me that didn't end up in the book was about creating an album cover that had let's see, how was it? It was like if you ordered, I'm gonna get some of the details wrong, but if you ordered an record, it was something about, oh, I know. They it was like one of the first mass mailing lists. Like when email was
Oh,
very
yeah.
new, they were like, put your, sign up for our email list. I hope I have these details right. And then you'll be on the album liner notes. And so then when the album came out, they emailed all the fans. I I guarantee someone who's listening is going to know this detail. I'm sorry if I got it wrong. But and then it was like you could buy the album and find your name on the liner notes. Well, that is
wow.
like a genius marketing strategy, right?
Huge,
Like,
yeah.
and so I'm sorry, Frank, if I get some small detail of that wrong, but I that is something that a major label, like by the 1990s, most major contemporary Christian music stuff, like stuff you'd hear on the radio, was owned by non-church related corporations. And
Right.
those labels just were so they were making so much money. I mean, they were producing like Britney Spears, and then they had like a division that was contemporary Christian music. But the tooth and nail type labels and bands, they were scrappy. They had to be really creative. And so I think they were also pretty forward thinking about like using the internet and understanding that grassroots marketing and touring was the stuff that was going to sustain you. So a lot of the bands, I think now, I would venture to say that they have more dedicated fans and listenership that have stayed with them, like through thick and thin, because of their kind of old school touring, in ways that there are so many people, like artists who probably sold a lot more records back in the day, but no one knows who they are now because they
Mhm.
were, kind of on the kind of traditional model. But I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but I have a lot of respect those folks, and I heard like just so many funny stories about just being young and dumb and, like touring the country when you're like 17 with
Right.
very little supervision. And those are great stories.
Well, what's interesting, and obviously, again, your book is like very much like CCM centric, which a lot of
Mhm.
people might put something like Tooth and Nail under. I actually have my own like grievances of like
Sure.
putting CCM and Tooth and Nail and those kind of bands in the same category, like
Same.
they're categorically different. But a
Mhm.
lot of people do, and so because of that, I at least have to like enter into that discourse. But regardless, what's interesting, again, because Cullen and I are coming from that world, and
Yeah.
because you're like you literally wrote a book about CCM, what's interesting about like that tooth and nail side of stuff is you have some of the most successful CCM artists come out of this like very independent and
Mhm.
scrappy kind of genre or label. I mean, you have so I mean, I know you don't really cover this, but like one of my fun facts to this day is the fact that Under Oath until 2014 had the highest charting Christian album of all time amongst Christians. Like that is, and I remember listening to an Under Oath episode a couple years ago where they were talking about this, where they had so there's six guys in Under Oath, there's six band members, and then a few of the label people, and then their producers, and a couple other people that were part of the kind of like album release cycle. But they were saying there were maybe like 15 to maybe 20 people who had any decision making power in that album at that time. and it went number 2 on the charts. And the next album that went higher than them was Nelly Furtado or whatever her name is,
Furtado. Yeah.
No, yeah,
Furtado,
yeah,
who
yeah.
probably had like at least hundreds of people who had at least
Yeah.
some sort of decision making power. Like
And
the
she was
fact
working
that
with
they
Timbaland, which is
right.
like, I mean, that's the top of the top in
That's
Yeah, I
terms of
mean,
top of the
music
truly.
producers.
yeah.
And like there might not be an album that has that few of people that are involved in the actual decision-making process of an album that went that high for, I mean, we might not see that again for years. And this is a Christian, like this is a Christian band, or at least at the time was labeled a Christian band. Like that to me is still mind-boggling. And we have other Christian bands like, Amberlin that was charting
Right,
almost nearly
right.
as high, and we've got a bunch of the other ones, and they're all coming out of this like small independent kind of scrappy label that's like started out with a guy who literally took a loan from his grandpa and had to repay his grandpa. Like that's how scrappy this was.
Yeah, I think, one of the questions that I try to tackle is why Tooth and Nail um succeeded on its own terms. I mean, I would say, I mean, I think the thing is that labels are really expensive. Like the music business is hard to
Yeah,
maintain.
yeah,
And so even Tooth and Nail was not immune from kind of the
totally.
corporate pressures. And at the end of the day, and I think this is something that really bothers a lot of like hardcore fans, the band that sustained Tooth and Nail was the OC Supertones, in a lot of ways,
And
because
Jeremy Camp.
exactly. And
Yes.
Yeah.
who buys those 2 bands' music,
Mamas.
Mm-hmm.
It's the moms. So I think, one of the funny things about the book has just been like, oh, this is an ode to like maternal authority. Because if those moms, I mean, I have some really funny stories in the book about because you bring up a lot of good points that Tooth and Nail, like that, and I would argue bands like Five Iron Frenzy were writing about things that were very subversive. I can't tell you the number of times. Maybe it's been you, Mason, also, who's tweeted something like "Five Iron Frenzy radicalized me" or some kind of way.
I'm
Because
sure that was me.
yeah, I think those ones are great. And I actually talked to Leonore Ortega Till, who Jeff, otherwise known as Jeff from Five Iron Frenzy, and I asked her, I was like, "How did you all get away with this? Like, you're saying stuff like directly going against Manifest Destiny, while Stephen Curtis Chapman's The Great Adventure, Saddle Up Your Horses is like
Right.
huge, and
Right.
I'm like, "How did you do that?" And she said something so funny. She was just like, I think that it was the kids were wearing, like, headphones. Their moms weren't listening, or it was the sounds that the moms weren't all that interested in, and so because there were I mean, a lot of the hardcore stuff was, like, definitely reinforcing, religious right stuff, so there was a lot of it that's super conservative, but,
Totally.
um, there's also a lot of it that was very subversive, and I think they kinda got away with that by getting around the moms. Although sometimes there are some funny stories where moms would read liner notes of Tooth and Nail albums just to make sure, and then
That was my mom.
edit. Oh, that's so sweet. I include a story in there, and actually I emailed the person because they filled out this survey that I made about contemporary Christian music, and they were, like, mortified when their mom, called the Tooth and Nail, like, mail order line to complain, um, and I was like, "This story is hilarious. Can I put it in the book?" And he was like, "Let me check with my mom." It was so sweet.
Yeah, like you
So
said, an
anyway, it's
ode
in
to
there.
female authority.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
brilliant.
Yeah,
I
those
mean,
moms,
that
man. Good
reminds
luck
me of
getting around them.
I still remember the very first moment I ever listened to Under Oath. And I
Oh, this
Yes.
is
remember,
great.
seeing them on like Steel Roots or whatever, some sort of like Christian, like music video kind of countdown type of thing. And
Uh-huh.
then finding them on like Pure Volume or MySpace or
Yes.
something, right?
Mhm.
And listening to Reinventing Your Exit or whatever was like on their Chasing Safety, which they just announced their 20th anniversary. And I remember listening to that on my little headphones that were like little over the ear headphone kind of things, whatever. And our computer was in like and Cullen would know this because like our computer was like in this little space that was like connected to the kitchen and living room, so it was in a very public space. So like if I was gonna
Conservative
be
Christian households
yeah,
always had
if
the
I was gonna be
computer in
messing
a
with
public
anything on
space.
the
That's right.
computer,
That's
it
right.
was out in
With
the
the little
open.
Bible verse,
There's no
Bible verse
hiding.
at the top.
Yes, the Bible
Yep.
verse
Oh,
above.
oh my
Yes.
God. Yes. I
No
still
evil
remember.
thing
Yep.
before your eyes.
It's
Anyway.
like you were you my mom? Uh, so anyway, I still remember listening to Under Oath, and my mom, like, because it was like crappy headphones, my mom could hear, I was jacked it up as loud as it could, and my mom could hear it through my headphones, and she was like, "What is that screaming you're listening to?"
Oh my goodness.
And I had to explain to her, I'm like, no, no, like, mom, I swear to God, like, it's a Christian band, like, I swear it's a Christian band.
Sing about the
And I
Lamb
had
of
to go
God.
through that whole like moment that
Yes.
so many others of us probably went through of like, Mom, I swear to God, this is like a Christian band. I just really, really like them. Like, please, 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 please let me listen to them. It's all I got, right? Like,
Oh my
I don't want to
gosh.
listen to Newsboys anymore. I just want to listen to my kind of music. And
I
I had
get
to
it.
like do that whole explanation. And I would
Mhm.
imagine so many of us had that kind of similar story.
Yeah.
And anyway, that's a whole
Absolutely.
thing that we had to navigate. And that is such a significant part of like that CCM history for so many of
Yes.
us.
I love that story so much. I mean, you set the scene so well. I feel like I was there. I feel like maybe there was some sort of brown tile at some like maybe on the counter answer. I don't
There
know.
definitely
But
was.
that
We had a
was
lot of
great.
brass at our
A lot
house.
of taupes going on. I'll tell you that
Love
much.
it. Oh yes, the era
Yeah.
of mauve.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that I mean, one of the funny things about that is that's just such a specific experience that can only happen if moms are the intermediary in an entire market, which
Hmm.
I think that has been it's the defining quirk of the Christian music world. And I would agree. I mean, one of the reasons why Tooth and Nail, and there have been a couple people who are like, she should have written more about Tooth and Nail, but I felt that it was an act of respect to say
Yeah.
that Tooth and Nail is not actually it exists, in a much different like, if you're gonna do a Venn diagram, there's only a couple bands that really stand out as, like, contemporary Christian music bands that would have been from Tooth and Nail,
Right.
but the rest of their roster exists in this other space, and many of the most notable of them, went on to be have mainstream labels and careers and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I think, but the experience, the fact that you still had that experience is just, it's so, I don't know. I've gotten a really big kick out of hearing all of those stories. There's like a ritual to it. It's like the
Yeah.
kid is hiding the thing, or maybe not hiding the thing, just like enjoying the thing. The mom intercedes, or intervenes. And anyway, sometimes a big brother or sister will like intercede on behalf of the younger, so anyway, I love it. Those are great
Yeah.
stories.
Going back to the thought process of commercialization
Hmm.
and big business,
Yes.
Mason brought up the Under Oath record that went absolutely nuts on the charts and everything.
Right.
I would argue that Solid State almost went the same route as the traditional CCM labels. Um,
Hmm.
right after that album release, obviously Solid State and Tooth and Nail are now flush with cash, and they are trying to treat all of their other, not all of them, a lot of their other artists very much the same way that Under Oath was trying to create the next Under Oath, right?
Mm.
Like bands like Acidy's Burn, Emery, these are bands
Mhm.
that all of a sudden quadrupled their recording budget. They quadrupled their touring budget. Instead of being in a van that they're driving themselves, now they're in a big bus that they get driven for them. Um, if that would have gone that route, if that model would have been successful and those other bands would have blown up to be the same size or have the same kind of success as Under Oath, what do you think happens in that Christian alternative scene like Solid State or Face Down or Flickr
Mm.
or whatever you want to whatever other label you want to throw out there?
Like, would it have a similar trajectory to
Yeah.
mainstream
Do you
CCM?
Exactly. Do you think that it would go the same route as CCM, and all of a sudden now all the music is less authentic, maybe,
Oh
maybe more
gosh.
generalized for the larger part of society, or I don't know. What do you think?
Okay, I'm having like three different thoughts at once. I'll try and keep it short. The first thought is I think there's always a tension in any kind of music that, especially if punk is involved in the question, then there's always like an issue, a worry about of selling out. So it doesn't matter if it's mainstream or
Mm,
Christian. Like that's a
Yeah,
huge because authenticity is such a highly prized um like virtue in punk and in like certainly many of the other forms of like metal um and so I would say that um I think that from that perspective, anytime there's like a lot of money being made, you're going to have fans who are super testy about that, because um on the one hand, probably people working at the labels are like, I just want insurance. But from the fans' perspective, they're like, it's kind of funny, not dissimilar from some radical teachings from Jesus, like money is going to be, a temptation for your soul. So I would guess that if they would have made a lot more money, that there would be inevitable conversation about that, about selling out. But that happens in mainstream spaces
sure.
as well, of course. I think that one of the things I think is really interesting about those labels and those bands, many of whom are no longer labeled, is the staying power that they had even when the internet just like completely overturned all of the business model in the early 2000s.
mm,
So I think one of the reasons why that the profitability that you're talking about didn't happen had to do with just the tech inventions that like
Yeah,
pulled the rug out from under everybody. But the fact that a lot of those bands are still around and that they're still connecting with fans, so that they had something that was per, it never had the numbers that the mainstream bands had, but it had more durability. Because I think like you two actually care, right? You really care. And there are not a lot of people who are like, I really cared about, and I'm not even going to say a band because someone's going to get mad at me, but the kind of the like the top selling CCM folks, um, they didn't have that kind of connection with their fans. So, yeah, I don't know. I wonder if like it in a weird way, artistically and kind of just the ethos, like maybe it was a better thing that they didn't, do that because you can't help yourself. Once you start making a lot of money, then you have to kind of manage that money
mhm,
and then
mm,
you make decisions to make more of it. And I actually don't I feel a certain amount of sympathy for people who are trying to, because then once people work for you, like a lot of artists that I talk to may have stayed quiet about certain social issues that they wish they would have said something about. And their reasoning at the time, and I feel empathy toward this, is that, hey, I have 10 people whose income, is based on my voice. So, I feel I guess maybe it's just getting like middle age where I'm like, okay, well, I actually understand that that is a hard decision to make.
Well, the big thing I wanna know is what is going to happen to CCM? The money is changing, right? The
Right.
industry's changing. Um,
Mhm.
it seems like it's harder and harder for the industry to create big pop stars. It's even
Right.
harder to create crossover,
Mhm.
appeal. Maybe not, if you're talking about, like, hip hop and stuff like that, maybe not so much, but if we're talking
Right.
about the pop stars, if we're talking about, even country artists,
Right.
it's
Right.
it's it's a difficult scene right now. And it seems to me, and maybe it's just because I'm less plugged in than I used to be in the CCM world, but is it kind of dying a slow death, or is it just still
Yes.
living off the
Yeah.
suburban moms?
That's such a great question, and that's something that I tackle in the book, which is, while so the internet just gutted the entire and I should say file sharing, gutted the entire music industry. Streaming also has done a lot of damage, and the way that mainstream bands and acts compensated for that was through they had a few different strategies. One was jacking up ticket prices. That's why it costs like an unbelievable amount of money to go see your favorite band. And through merchandise and stuff like that. But there were changes in evangelicalism that were happening that were related to technology, but just other shifts that undermined that like method of compensation. So you rightly have recognized that a lot of the mechanisms that upheld CCM. So I'm thinking of the parachurch organizations, the
Mm.
Christian conferences, the Christian music festivals, the Christian camps, the churches themselves are changing. So, for example, the Americans are worshiping less often and consolidating in mega churches. And what that does is it has killed the mid-sized church, which for CCM development networks is it even and especially some of those like tooth and nail type bands, that's devastating because
Mm-hmm.
the model used to be, you play a little church in a coffee shop and then you kind of work your way to a medium-sized church and then you eventually get at the big churches and then these like huge conferences and Campus Crusade for Christ and stuff like that. And without that robust network, you just don't really have an industry. So there are a lot of legacy acts, like Toby Mac is still touring.
Right.
The Newsboys, they're like the Leonard Skinner of CCM because like they just have a rotating crew of
Did they
people.
survive a plane crash
I
too?
was gonna say
From
there's no
Australia to
no plane
here?
crash though.
God, can't believe they didn't
They're
land in
like
the Indian Ocean.
they have even more legendary tales, I'm sure. But so yeah, the worship music has taken the spots of most like on quote unquote Christian radio, you'll hear worship music, which is the music of the mega church. So it's like mega churches have, and mega churches are like they don't need touring bands. I don't know, I pay attention to this stuff. Not everybody does, but if you look at the videos that Elevation Church is producing, I mean, they're excellent technically. Like you would be hard pressed to find like they're really well done in terms of like the lighting and the sound and so what I'm saying is they don't need a touring band. They are like they're a little music empire in and of
Yeah.
themselves.
And then they
So
get to
that
license
has just
that
killed
music
it.
out to all the little churches and everything
Mhm.
like that, and then you're basically creating
Yeah.
this really, really small ecosystem that gets smaller and smaller every year, right?
But it has this outsized influence, like, people all over the world are
Yeah.
singing their music, so they are shaping, like, how people are doing things. These very well-funded, um, charismatic mega churches. And then the big one of the devastating things is that the white women of the suburbs did not have enough kids. And so the moms, there are fewer of them. So I read it in the book about how certain conservative radio stations have courted Latinas, like so basically where it would like English speaking Latinas are kind of the new white suburban mom market that they're trying to attract. So like Salem or Caleb, they would be targeting those women, but it's not enough of a market to sustain the business. So to your question, I think, and also like the women, by the way, you may or may not know this, but they were known by the marketing persona of Becky. So
Yeah,
Becky's,
heard
yeah.
of
So
that before.
Becky's, I sometimes I'll just be like, so anyway, Becky's, and people are like, what are you talking about? But so the Becky's, they themselves don't even listen to music the same way as much anymore. So the traditional CCM model was like you get music curated for you by these Christian radio stations, while even conservative suburban moms now stream, so the whole way of finding things. And then, of course, I should say Christian bookstore, death of the Christian bookstore. You can't overstate
Sure.
how much that devastated the business. So, will like conservative revivalists mobilize through music? Certainly, but it's not going to look like what it did with contemporary Christian music because it's just like not the same set of circumstances. Now they have TikTok and now they have this
Yeah.
other ways of being in the world. But that kind of the idea that like there you couldn't find a Christian college that didn't have like a band with bongos and like
Oh yeah.
like somebody doing some sort of extreme ripoff. Like those are fewer and fewer, I think. So
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's actually really connected to the question I was about to ask. But yeah, one of the questions I've had when I've talked about this with different people is like, what is the average youth group kid now? Like I've been out of
right.
evangelicalism for over 10
Yeah.
years. Cullen has as well.
Yeah.
Like we've been out of youth group culture for 10 years, and that's kind of when we started like quote unquote deconstructing and everything. And so I feel very like sort of out of that world. Like I have no idea what's even happening now. Like I don't know. Like I remember when Cullen and I were in high school, it was like Francis Chan and all the stuff that we grew up with. And now it's like I don't even know who those big names are even anymore. Like maybe it's some Hillsong people. I mean I truly have no idea. And so
Yeah.
anyway, like
Yeah.
one of the questions I've wondered is what do we do with like the idea around the fact that like the average youth group kid now has no sense of like being a tooth and nail kid or whatever. Like they don't have like they don't
Yeah.
have their Reliant K or whatever. Like maybe the closest they have is like Lauren Daigle, but that might be it.
That's a great question. And that's another thing. So the youth group, one of the people that I talked with who was super helpful was a guy named Mark Ostreicher, who used
Mm-hmm.
to, of Youth Specialties, if you've ever heard of
Mm-hmm.
Youth Specialties.
Yeah.
And he was so insightful. And I just asked him, like, does youth ministry still exist? Like it did then? And his short answer was no, that like the modes of doing youth ministry that facilitated contemporary Christian music have changed. Some of it's just competition. So there's a historian guy named Paul Putz. I got to give Paul a shout out here, who's working on a book about evangelicals and sports culture. So a lot of evangelicals find that you don't even so CCM really did depend on the church building, but sports don't it doesn't depend on that. So like you can like do evangelical spiritual formation while you're playing soccer or something like that. And
Mm.
so some of the things that like the need for youth group has decreased in part because there's just increased competition for other forms of like betterment, like evangelical betterment, where they're trying to make sure their
Sure.
kids go to dance lessons and so it's like that has undermined because a lot of contemporary Christian music depended on kids hanging out in a youth room, with a
Is that why that
crappy.
whole thing about like that high school football coach praying at football games or whatever was such a big deal for them? Was because that football coach, it was like such a statement around like we're going to create football coaches now that are going to show up, and that's where they're going to be like sort of ministered to, is like they're going to be ministered to on the practice and game field rather than like in a church youth group basement.
I do think that coaches, take on that type of role. If you're going to take away the youth pastor, and I will say, I think for most people, this no one is consciously doing this. It's just how markets shift over time. It's like, you know, it's not like everyone all of a sudden decided, I'm just going to get a caramel macchiato every day of my life. It was just like Starbucks came and then they found they liked it. I mean, I think that evangelicals, at least with CCM, they're best understood as consumers, like what are they buying? And what are they, like how are they spending their time? And so I think that probably very few people consciously thought that, but I could totally see that logic going into it because
Mm.
these people are playing really critical roles, and sports evangelicals have a long history of like looking at sports, especially for young men, but for young women too, as an opportunity to like create ideal evangelical bodies. And so, like a lot of the mainstream CCM was about regulating evangelical teens. Like
Mm.
don't have sex. Like these are the kinds of ways that you should be in the world. And in some ways, sports can offer a different, take on that same idea. So yeah, I think those are some of the things that killed it. And then also just the way people listen to music. The idea that and maybe some people will fight you on this, but the idea that a specific genre really defines you, I don't know if that is as strong of an idea in youth culture. A lot of young people seem to have really varied musical listening tastes. Like
Yeah.
in the 90s, if you were somebody who listened to like death metal, you might not want to be known for listening to Britney or something like
Right.
that. But now I think people have, and maybe it's a good thing. The young people are like, you like what you like, and I'll listen to whatever. Um, I don't know. But yeah, I don't even know if that's helpful, but that was what was on my mind.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
All I hear is that Martin Luther just offered a better product than indulgences. That's all.
I love it. You heard it here first.
If we take the same line of reasoning back far enough, maybe 500 years, that's all I'm hearing.
Could be.
Yeah.
Could be. Yeah. You'll have to bring
All
a
right.
modern historian. Okay.
All right, so you only got a little bit of time. So let's dive into your top 5 most influential albums. So let's hear, what are the albums that have shaped you in your life?
I get really nervous for these kinds of questions because I am not a music critic. I try to be super clear about that in the book.
That's okay.
But I've
You can
spent.
be a total music, I just love this artist so much.
Okay, I feel your non-judgment, so thanks a lot. So I'm
Yeah,
gonna answer
yeah,
honestly.
we're if you think of Cullen Mac, I do not think of Judgment at all. I just,
Okay.
I
So
like
I'm
Train and Cullen likes Creed, so there's no judgment here.
Yeah.
really, I love that. Okay, safe space. I feel it. I feel that. Okay, so I'm a huge fan of like, you like what you like. I don't care. Okay,
Yeah.
so first album, I would have to say Keith Green's No Compromise in the spirit of
Oh
just,
yeah,
Yes.
my roots.
Oh, yes.
of
Um,
course.
so
Cullen's
that
like the biggest Keith Green guy, by the way.
I am.
oh, so sweet. Yes,
His
yes.
personal
So
story, his music, everything. Yeah.
yes. So that I'd have to say, related to that, and this is the music that my dad did allow in our house. Jesus Christ Superstar is a
Oh,
huge foundational album
okay.
in my life.
I've got it
All
on
I,
right.
vinyl.
so one of the reasons why I think I felt like such an affinity for CCM is because I grew up absolutely loving an even quirkier, weirder subculture of music, which is
Show
musical theater.
tunes.
Oh gosh,
Yes.
I love show tunes so much. And Jesus Christ Superstar is the kind of my original one. But then when I was in high school, I'm being transparent here.
I love
I
it.
have two high school albums. I mean, one is just because of and I'm going to sound so basic, but Nirvana's Nevermind. I just
Yeah.
it's like I'm from the Pacific Northwest, so I have to do that. And I
Yes.
know everyone's going to be like, "That's the wrong grunge album."
No, that is
No,
But
you
absolutely the
definitely say
right
it.
album.
okay. I was like, should I say Alice in Chains? And then I'm like, nope, I'm just gonna go with Nirvana.
Wait,
So that
did you wait for I forget what they call them now, but the track where it was silent for 10
absolutely.
minutes and
Oh,
then all of a sudden
of course.
Hidden
I
I forget
mean,
track.
what that track
yeah,
was called, but oh my
yeah.
god, and it's just it's so guttural and it's so
I'm
punk and everything about it I love.
I'm from Oregon, so it's just yes. So yeah, never mind. I would have to say so then like my senior year, I got really into Rent. I'm telling you, I'm very,
Love
very
it.
much
Oh, yes.
so
Love it.
Rent. Um,
It's
okay.
obvious you became a scholar someday. I mean, that's
I
just
know. That's what
plain
I'm
as
saying.
day.
Like I have the most nerdy taste ever. Um, in terms of things that I
You don't
just
happen to be
keep
a professor, do you?
I know. I'm like, um, I'm gonna go with maybe oh gosh, I just don't even know. Okay, wait, let me think about it. Hades Town. I'm really into that right now. You guys, this is gonna
Hades
be
Town.
no, I guarantee no one who listens to this podcast is gonna know what
Hades,
it
like
is.
the Greek god?
Yes, it's a retelling of a Greek myth. It's musical theater. I mean, I'm just telling you, that's what I really
Okay.
like. And
Oh,
I'm sorry
Is
to all of your
Broadway.
fans who wanted me to list something that's more interesting to you, but yep, those are and you know what? I'm going to just wake up in the middle of the night thinking that I should have said something else. But thank you for letting
no,
me
hey.
be me.
No, that's good. I unabashedly love Phantom of the Opera and Sweeney
Great.
Todd and stuff like that. So,
Oh, that is
there's
great.
there's nothing wrong with a little musical theater. I like it.
Okay. Well,
I'll let you two teachers just geek out then.
that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, yeah, so anyway, but I know, yeah, you guys got to get going, but I should have done that faster, but
Are
Well,
you
you
we
ready?
should do one thing before we go. We haven't
Okay.
even said the name of the book.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah,
Yes.
God gave
Uh,
rock and roll to you.
God gave
It
rock.
was-
Yeah, there we go. Yeah,
Thanks. God gave rock and roll to you. The
roll.
history of contemporary Christian music.
in my head forever now.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry. Sorry, not sorry.
Where can people find the book? Where would you encourage people to find the
Oh,
book?
yeah, you can find it on Oxford University Press on their website or at Amazon and
Love
or
it.
anywhere, your local bookseller. Yes.
Love it. And where can people get
Perfect.
connected with you and your work?
You
Obviously,
can
you and I are connected on Twitter. Is that one of those places where you would
Yes, you can
encourage
find
people to
me.
find you?
Yes, Dr. Leah Payne, DrLeahPayne on pretty much any social media outlet. Yeah, thank you so much.
Love it. Love it.
Perfect.
Anything
Thank
else
you.
you'd like to
Thank you.
plug?
Thank you.
Oh, anything else? Yeah, if you are fans, because I'm from the Portland area, if you're fans
Of
of the
course.
show Portlandia, you will see me
Yes,
as
of
an
course.
extra in one of the episodes where they talk about two people who pretty much end their lives as they know it by watching Battlestar Galactica. So look for me
Okay.
in the background of one
You
of
don't
those.
remember
Alright,
what
alright.
season was that on? Maybe do you remember?
Oh gosh, I can't remember. It's been so long. Maybe second season, maybe third season.
Okay.
I don't know. I can't remember, but yeah, look for me.
God,
Alright,
it
we'll
might
look
have
for
been
you.
10 years ago when second
Yeah.
season came out,
Yeah.
so who knows?
Yeah.
But
I think it's
great.
longer now.
Well,
Thanks, you guys.
I'll go on YouTube to go look for that episode because
That's
it's been that
great.
long ago. But I'm looking forward to it. Well, Leah, thank you so much for chatting more about
Thank you.
CCM. Again, this is just so great. I mean, obviously, there's like so much more we could talk about. And maybe we'll bring you on at some point again to chat a little bit more about it. But thank you so much for writing about the book and chatting more about it.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It was a pleasure.